It's now time to look at one of Excel's most powerful tools, the pivot table. What's that? Well, it's basically where we can pull our data into Excel and treat it like a Rubik's Cube. So we can quickly pivot and change the way that we're looking at data to get different insights out of it. Now, the secret to starting with a pivot table is to have a good data source. What makes a good data source? You've heard this before. A good header row, no blank rows or columns in the data, and consistent data down the actual columns as far as types go. The easiest way to ensure that? Format as a table. So we'll take this data and we'll quickly go and turn this into a nice table. Notice it has headers. That's great. And we'll go and rename this table immediately to something like inventory. Now, to create the pivot table itself, this is super easy. We can click somewhere in our pivot table, go to the Insert tab, and choose to insert a pivot table. Notice that it picks up the table's name. And this is great because as your table expands, all the new data will automatically be pulled into it. I'm going to go place this on an existing worksheet, and I'm going to drop it right here in cell H5. And we'll say OK. This creates the pivot table frame. And you'll notice that we have the ability over here to look at all these different fields, which come from the headers of the actual table. What I'm going to do with this now is I'm going to take sold by, and I'm going to drag it down here and drop it in rows. And you'll notice that there we go. We have a unique list of every single salesperson, no matter whether this is 15 or 15,000 rows of data. I'm going to put inventory item underneath my rows by just checking it right here, and you'll notice that it now shows every sales item for every salesperson. On my values, I'm going to check the box next to cost. Because it's numeric, it automatically throws it into the values area. And then I'm going to look at this and say, I'm not sure I like the layout of this pivot table. I think I would actually rather see my employees across the top so I can see what the sales are by item by employee. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take sold by, and I'm just going to left click and drag it up here to columns, and that repivots the table into a different format. And this is the real strength of a pivot table, is the ability to actually change things. And then I realized, wait a minute, I don't really want to see cost. I actually want to see the price. So let's uncheck cost, or drag it out, whichever, and check price. And there we go. Now we're actually showing the sales price. So that's pretty good. Now, the pivot table is super useful for all of the values that we can get out of it nice and quick. This is way faster than writing a whole bunch of sum-if formulas in order to make this work. But the pivot table does have one nuance that you need to be aware of. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to dismiss the field list here. Now, we can always bring this back anytime we want by right-clicking on the pivot table and saying Show Field List. I just want to get it out of the way for a minute because I want to be able to show you something really important. Let's say that Fred's kitten that he sold here was a really important one. It was a very, very lovable kitten, and it was worth $1.5 million. You would think that when you change this, that it would be pretty obvious for our lovable kittens for Fred that it would actually update right away, and plainly it did not. And the reason being is because the pivot table actually uses something called the pivot cache in its process. What that means is it streams all of the data when you create it into the pivot cache, and it pre-calculates everything that you could want. And that's why when you're dragging and dropping fields, whether there's 15 rows or 15,000 rows, it's just as fast. The problem is it's disconnected from the calculation chain. So in order to update this, we need to remember that pivot tables are not live. And to do this, we go right-click and choose Refresh. And now you'll see that our 1.5 million comes in. There's also another way to do this too. If I go back and say 45 and hit Enter, we'll change it back. It obviously hasn't updated here. My personal preferred way to update things is to actually go to the Data tab and click the Refresh All button. And that's because I can create multiple pivot tables off of multiple tables, and this one will refresh everybody all at once. So the pivot table is hugely useful. It allows you to quickly go and reshape your data. If you don't like the format, you just drag fields around to different places or drag them off or uncheck them. And away you go. You got lots of different ways to report from a small or large data set.